Foraging for wild mushrooms is not a new activity, and although recently gaining in popularity, people have been harvesting wild mushrooms for thousands of years. Some people gather just enough for the dinner table. Some are gathering mushrooms to study for science. Some to dye fabrics. Some purely for recreation. Some for medical research. And others are commercially picking to fill the shelves in grocery stores. But are harvesting techniques sustainable? Do we really know what it does to the life of a mushroom patch when we pick the mushrooms? One of the most debated and frequently asked questions when it comes to picking mushrooms is it better to cut or to pluck the mushroom when harvesting?
This is a highly debated subject. It gets people riled up pretty quickly sometimes. People get upset over this.
If you follow any Facebook groups that are concerned with wild mushrooms, you will constantly see the debate surface, usually between novice foragers. But what is the truth? Does it really make a difference for the life of a mushroom patch to cut or to pluck? We're going to look at the different ideas on this topic and hope to expose some of the truths about the cut or pluck debate here on this episode of Mushroom Wonderland.
Welcome to Mushroom Wonderland.
Every spring, mushroom hunters head into the hills of eastern Washington and Oregon to harvest black morel mushrooms by the ton. They are then shipped to markets around the world. Harvesters are experienced outdoors people who hike among the hills for days, among the remnants of the forest fires of last year, where the delectable fungi like to grow. When they come across a patch of mushrooms in the wild, they cut it at the base with a sharp knife, leaving the base and the mycelium intact. Most will tell you that it is to help keep dirt out of their basket. Adversely, in the autumn and living forest of the same area, commercial mushroom hunters harvest thousands of pounds of matsutake, which they are careful to pluck completely from the soil with the entire stem base intact. Of course, an untold amount of mushrooms are overlooked or unseen, and these mushrooms are able to produce spores, the reproductive cell of the fungi. But does taking all of those spore-producing fruiting bodies out of the forest hurt the overall population of the fungi? First, let's have a brief overview of what a mushroom is. A mushroom is a fruiting body. It is the means for which fungi reproduce itself sexually, with multiple spores mating to create a new mycelium. The actual body of the fungus is living underground, or whichever substrate it can derive dead matter from for food. These are called saprobes. Other types of mushrooms, known as ectomycorrhizal mushrooms, associate with certain trees or plants to exchange nutrients. Both types of fungus create what we know as mushrooms, or macrofungi, that we can see with our naked eye. These are where the spores are produced, and they are sent into the wind to seek out new suitable material and start a new colony of fungi. A somewhat inaccurate but simple comparison would be an apple tree bearing a fruiting body, with seeds inside to reproduce itself. The apples grow once a year when the conditions are right, and after producing viable seeds, they will fall from the tree and rot. Or even better for the tree, someone or something comes along and picks the apples and carries the seeds to a further destination. The cycle repeats itself every year, and the growth and detachment of apples seem to do no harm to the tree. Mushrooms are much the same way in a lot of respects. They typically grow once per annual weather cycle, and some seem to be quite seasonal. After or during their growth, they may be stepped on or kicked over, may be eaten by a huge variety of animals, insects, and other fungi alike. Some are crushed under early snow, some are smashed by falling branches and by forest fires. So are we naive to think that we can have an impact on a process that's been happening for eons? Does it really make a difference whether you cut or pluck a mushroom? Does it harm the patch, or could it possibly help it grow? Here are a few amazing mycologists' take on it that were nice enough to give an interview for this video.
So, in ecosystems that are in danger, that are shrinking, logically, if you remove the parents, you'll have less spores, less progeny for the future associations. So, we have to contextualize this. And habitats that are not shrinking, that are more or less sustainable in their natural state, are being replenished. And in particular, with the saprophytes, I don't think harvesting the mushrooms by plucking them is a great concern. But let's keep in mind that mushrooms attract animals, insects, also deer, for instance. Deer cut the mushrooms, and then they may pluck them and then bite off the stem butt several feet away and then drop it. We know from psilocybe cyanescens and azurescens that stem butts regrow. So in this case, plucking and cutting could actually help spread the species.
We have an oversimplified narrative of what is harming or what is not harming when it comes to harvesting. We know that some species live as short-lived little genetic units, and those ones, where the spores might not last as long, like some Amanita, those are more susceptible. If you pick them over and over and over again, they might not come back. But we have this nice longitudinal study of 10 or 15 years in Oregon on our chanterelles, and they showed no change if you pick them. You know, we can't say for sure what's gonna happen in 100 years if we pick all the boletes on a hill. You know, I think just always err on the side of leaving some stuff. But the analogy of an apple to a tree falls short of what's really going on. And in some cases, it could definitely be harmful. With matsutake, we've seen it get chased out of habitats, you know? That's something that's people have witnessed, and now there are people here who can no longer pick their mushrooms in Japan.
But you kind of need the base and everything to ID a lot of mushrooms, right?
That's true, yeah.
Like
ID,
matsutake.
You know, I think the people who are in it to ID things aren't going to be the ones who are exhausting any resources, usually.
Cut or pluck?
I think it's best to pluck them and then take those stem bases and then cut them off and plant them in new areas. That's going to be way better than anything else, but it doesn't really matter if you cut them or pluck them unless you're disturbing the mycelium a whole lot.
Would you leave behind little pins like that regularly, do you think?
Yeah, you definitely don't want to pick pins. Also, a little thing like this, it hasn't released any spores yet, so if you pick a big mushroom like this, it's been throwing spores into the air for a week, and you know, something like this hasn't had a chance to do that yet. So I'm picking this one just for the photo because I want one of each stage of development, but almost always, yeah, something little like that, I'll always leave it.
Cut or pluck? My rule is look around me, see who else is picking with me, and if they have religious objections to one or the other, I just go along with what they do to be nice. My real reaction is I cut when I'm pretty sure I can get all of the edible fruit of the mushroom, and I pluck when I think I have got to go deep to get the whole stalk. I'm convinced that it makes no difference whatsoever to the fate of the fungus underneath the ground, because exactly how many little strands of mycelium you pull up along the way, I don't really think matters.
To cut or to pluck? To cut or pluck? What do you say about that?
Well, you know, talking about mycelium again, really, for the vast majority of species, I'd say there might be some exceptions. You're really not going to be harming the mycelium, which is generally many orders of magnitude larger than the mushroom you're taking, underneath or in the log or substrate. You pulling or cutting that mushroom is really not going to affect it. The mycelium has already spent its nutrients producing that mushroom, and for most species we collect too, by the time you pull them, they've already released a lot of spores, and they're releasing spores as you carry them through the woods on your way out. Many have argued that humans do a better job of dispersal than some mushrooms would have sitting wherever they are. They'll create their own airflow, and if you have a nice flashlight at night, you can see it. There's sort of this convection thing that goes on that'll pull them up the top, and you'll see these streams coming sort of like downwind off the top, and they'll definitely end up pretty far, 'cause You also got to keep in mind, theoretically only one spore has to make it to a new viable site in order to start a new colony.
There have been several studies done, several international scientific studies done over the past several decades that all conclude the same thing. Pick versus cut does not matter. If the mushrooms have the nutrients and the environment to continue growing, they will do so that season and in future seasons, no matter how they were harvested. Beyond, don't trample the ground, don't use a rake and truly disturb the mycelium. Mushrooms don't care. You can literally take the whole patch if you want to, and that patch will either pop right back that year if it wants to, or the next year. Patches will come and fade naturally over time. My own experiences are completely to the contrary. I pick every gosh darn mushroom I see in certain places, and they come back stronger than ever every single year.
To cut or to pluck?
Pluck, always. For identification purposes, we have to see the base of the mushroom. It's just I have no room for debate on that. Unless if it's a mushroom that you've already identified and you want to take home for the basket to eat, go ahead, cut the base of the chanterelle off. You're losing some of it, it's a waste. Sometimes people say actually even cutting it might invite some microbial decomposition towards that organism that wouldn't have, but I mean, at least the one study I know about, which I could do more digging, says it doesn't make a difference. But for identifying mushrooms, you need to see the base. We need to see, does this mushroom have a vulva like an amanita? Does it have a swollen bulbous base? Is there a long taproot? Is there fuzzy, like a fuzzy base? Sometimes mushrooms will just have crazy fuzz only at the bottom. So if we don't see that, it's going to make it much harder to identify. And it's also, if you're going to vouch for that specimen, save it for science, either for you or for someone else. For them to study it, they need to be able to see the whole picture, because that mushroom could contribute to a description of a new species. But if we don't know what the base looks like, then we gotta hope that we can get another collection. For me, and I also have fun kind of following the mushroom down. Chanterelles have this beautiful windy stipe, so it's always fun to kind of follow it gently. Don't like rip it out, but just, take some time, be diligent.
I don't have particularly strong feelings about this either way myself, but I see a lot of gatekeeping in our community, especially online, over people who say it is much more important to cut a mushroom at the base when you harvest it versus just plucking it out of the ground. And the assumption there is that somehow cutting a mushroom does less damage to the mycelium below than plucking a mushroom. But it doesn't appear that the harvesting practice, whether you're plucking or you're cutting, has any real significant difference. That being said, there are a few mushrooms that I specifically like to cut instead of pluck. And those are generally stuff like polypores, where I want to cut off just the leading edge of the mushroom, the fleshy, soft part that I actually want to eat, and I'll leave the rest of it embedded inside the wood so it continue to grow, or at least the parts of the mushroom that are there will continue to disperse their spores. If I come across a cluster of mushrooms, where I want to harvest one or two of the mushrooms, but maybe not the whole cluster, that's where specifically I will use a knife. I do like to cut morels, and the specific reason for cutting morels is because I'm on the West Coast and I usually hunt burn morels. So I'm hunting around in habitats where the soil is very affected by the burn. It's very fragile soil, it's easy to disturb, and instead of ripping mushrooms out and causing sort of holes in the mycelium, I like to trim the base off. Sometimes I'll pinch off with my finger as well. So, like I said, I don't have particularly strong feelings about whether it's better to cut or pluck, but I do recognize that the main goal and the purpose of this whole discussion is to cause less harm to the mycelium below. Even when I do pluck a mushroom, I will usually take my knife and trim off the base of the mushroom while I'm there in the woods. I'll try to take those pieces, put them back into the hole where I took the mushroom out of, and then I'll move the forest floor, the duff, the twigs, the leaves, back over the hole and try to protect the mycelium below.
Thanks for inviting me to stand off on this. The controversy between cut and pluck is going on for quite some time. If you're picking for the table, I would say just cut. That's minimal damage to the mycelium. And if you cut, all the dirt from the base is not going to come into your soup or anything you prepare. But, however, if you're trying to figure out the difference between Leucoagaricus leucophytes and an amanita, you definitely want to get the whole stem up. Even shredded bits of vulva are important to determine whether you have a deadly amanita or an edible leucophytes. So it really depends on what you're after. But in general, I would cut unless it's really critical to find out what's happening at the stem base.
In reflecting on whether one should cut or pluck, I think you're going to go around in circles because there's all kinds of different opinions and there are some special circumstances. But in general, I don't think it makes a load of difference whether you cut or pluck. I generally prefer to cut my mushrooms off at ground level, mainly because it makes it much easier to bring them home and clean them in the kitchen later without having a lot of dirt and forest debris to deal with. Now, of course, if you're cutting the mushrooms at ground level and you're dealing with gilled mushrooms, you've got to make bloody well sure that you know what amanitas look like and you aren't cutting amanitas off at the base and missing the vulva in the ground and getting yourself in trouble as a result of eating a cut mushroom. I really love it when somebody has cut their king boletes off right at ground level, because if I find where they've done that within a day or two, I can get my favorite part of the bolete, the very base of the stem, and I pluck that from the ground and eat that. And sometimes I've been able to fill a shopping bag or two full of just stem bases, even though someone has beaten me to the patch. So having people that only cut can be an advantage in something like a king bolete. Now, if you're picking a cauliflower mushroom, you want to make very sure that you leave the stem intact. So you cut it off right at the base of that big lump of cauliflower, and you're much more likely to have that thing refruit again and again, year after year, as long as you leave the stem behind. So in that case, it makes a significant difference. Now, when you're talking about a matsutake, I don't like to reach down and dig it out, but you also don't want to cut it off because a lot of the value lies in that getting the whole matsutake. So I grab those from the very top of the cap and just put my fingers on the top and rotate it in circles for a while until it gets loose from the soil, and then I can pull it straight up and I don't have to put any implements in the ground and disturb the mycelium, and then that will preserve the production for the future. And the one thing that I'd be really clear on is you do not want to rake for mushrooms. If you're after truffles, you're going to wind up raking mostly immature truffles, and you're going to ruin it for future harvest. So by using a dog to harvest truffles, you can come back to the same patch in season every 4 to 5 days and get more truffles. But if you raked it, you've wiped it out probably for the rest of the season. Similarly, with king boletes, you can return to a king bolete patch every single day and have new prime boletes as long as you don't rake the ground.
I totally agree with everything that Dr. Michael Bugh said. He did such a good job. I had a very interesting experience. Psilocybe baeocystis is very rare. I found it a few years ago. I was so excited, I hadn't seen it in 10 years. And I had just a few fruit bodies, and I walked from my house down to my laboratory on a straight line, a little indentation in the grass. And lo and behold, 1 year later, Psilocybe baeocystis was growing right along that grass line path that I had indented into my yard. Wow. I thought, wow, okay, spores are trailing the mushrooms when you harvest them. So this is another way that mushrooms can spread themselves, is by animals, me being an animal, carrying mushrooms that I had plucked, not cut. So this debate is fun because I don't think there's one answer. I think we have to look at every situation circumstantially and also genomically in terms of how common the species is. There's a lot of things that can be true about different people's points of view. I don't think we can, quote unquote, paint the canvas with one brush.
Now let's look at the research. In Switzerland, a study was conducted over a 27-year period from 1977 to 2003. 5 300 square meter blocks were divided into 10 by 10 meter plots containing 3 treatments. One harvesting by picking, the other harvesting by cutting, and then a control group. In treatment plots, all edible mushrooms were plucked or cut weekly throughout every fruiting season, May through December, in a manner mimicking that of a mushroom harvester. Plucking mushrooms entailed pulling the entire mushroom from the soil with some damage to the mycelium. Cutting mushrooms entailed slicing the stipe with a knife close to the ground, thus avoiding damage to the mycelium. All observation plots were surrounded by fences to avoid disturbance by other mushroom pickers. In this study, no difference in species richness or abundance of species of edible fungus was evident in the harvested compared with the non-harvested site. The mycelium continues to grow underground regardless of what happens to those fruiting bodies. There was another 10-year study between 1990 and 2000, which included trampling while picking, while a different group of mushrooms had catwalks installed so that the ground wouldn't be tread on at all. As with the first study, the results suggest that the production of fruiting bodies was unaffected by harvesting. However, trampling significantly reduced the amount of fruiting bodies produced. In every year, the number of fruiting bodies produced was lower in the trampled plots, and data analysis suggests that trampling reduces fruit body production by 30%. So crushing of the fruiting bodies probably played a huge part in that. In 1986, the Oregon Mycological Society initiated North America's longest continuous investigation into the impact of harvesting on subsequent productivity. Cantharellus formosus, the Pacific golden chanterelle, is a choice edible mushroom commercially harvested from the Pacific Northwest forests. A total of 10 individual plots were established on a 120-year-old Douglas fir stand in the Mount Hood National Forest. 9 years of harvesting data indicate that removal of chanterelles may slightly stimulate subsequent chanterelle productivity in the short term. There seems to be little to no correlation between productivity and the harvesting method. The internationally recognized study demonstrates how collaboration between professionals and amateurs can contribute significant and valuable scientific knowledge. Some people would claim that cutting a mushroom and leaving the exposed stump still attached to the mycelium can introduce harmful pathogens and bacteria to the underground mycelium. But it's hard to believe that this is a threat when most mushrooms in the wild will decay still attached to the mycelium.
My name is Paul Hill. I've been an instructor with the Puget Sound Mycological Society and have been picking mushrooms for 18 years. The reason for plucking, people say, well, if you cut, they suggest that you're opening up a wound in the mushroom. And then I have to point out that the mushroom, if something got into it, where does it go? It goes to the base of the mushroom. There's no root below. There's no taproot. There's no base of roots. There's these fine mycelium network under the duff in the beginning of the dirt, under the forest. If something got down, if a microbe or something got in there, it would just get to the mycelium. The mycelium is not a root. It doesn't have a structure. It doesn't have a skin and specialized cells that protect the outside and pump nutrients on the inside and provide structure and strength in other places, like on a tree. The mycelium network is all the same little threads. So something gets in there, and those little threads, they know how to deal with the soil that they're in. They're almost all of them are touching the environment. So there's no inside to infect. The mycelium knows how to deal with everything in the soil. It secretes enzymes that break things down. So the idea that you are wounding the underground tree, as it were, and introducing something, I don't see that as an argument against cutting.
So I guess at the end of the day, my take on the subject is that it really kind of depends. But the truth is that pulling the fruiting bodies is not going to hurt the mycelium underground. That's really all you need to know. Trampling or raking, using all of those kind of really harsh harvesting techniques, of course, not a good idea. I think our gut is right when it tells us that. But it really doesn't make that much of a difference for your lobster mushroom, matsutake, chanterelles. Just try to tread lightly so you're not smashing too many young mushrooms. If you really want to try to help the fungus, it doesn't matter so much whether you cut or pluck, but you can get one of these mesh picking bags, comes over your shoulder, and when you harvest the mushrooms, whichever way you harvest them, you put them in here, then the mushrooms have a chance to drop the spores onto the forest floor. This is one way that you can help promote the growth of the fungi, regardless of whether you cut it with this cool knife or you decide to pluck them out for identification purposes. Carry them in something like this or a basket, and it can drop spores along the way as you walk. So thanks for joining this super important episode of Mushroom Wonderland. Please hit subscribe and we'll see you on the next episode. Much love, everyone. Peace.